All right, this is the part of the material for lesson 2 I didn't get through during class. So we're going to talk about cost behavior, and there's 3 different types of cost behavior we're going to cover. There's variable, fixed, and mixed costs. So as the level of activity changes, some of the cost will change and others will stay the same. So this is the cost behavior we're talking about. So knowing the cost behavior helps management plan the operations and decide what different alternatives they would like. So as the activity level changes, you can express that in sales dollars or miles driven or the room occupancy. So each company is going to use different ways of expressing their cost behavior, whatever makes the most sense for the type of business you're in. So if you are a trucking company, the cost behavior is talked about in terms of the miles driven. So the more miles that are driven, the more gasoline would be used. So the cost behavior analysis is looked at in terms of the miles that are driven. Now, many companies will use more than one measurement base, so they might be looking at the miles driven and the areas that the trucks are driven through. So some areas might have a higher risk because there's political instability in some areas and there's not political instability in other areas. Um, so cost behavior talks about changes in the volume that are correlated with changes in the cost. And you're picking that activity level that is tied to the changes in the cost. So your activity index is going to be tied to the behavior that drives or the activity that drives the cost. So a variable cost is there's a direct relationship between the activity and the cost. So if you have a 10% increase in activity, you would expect a 10% increase in the cost. So that would be a variable. And a variable cost remains the same per unit at every level of activity. So when you graph it, you see a straight line. So this is the relationship between the cost and the units. So if you're graphing cost per unit, so this is total variable cost, this is cost per unit, it's a straight line. Then, so here's a question. If the variable costs are costs that vary in total directly and proportionately with changes in the activity level, remain the same per unit at every activity level. So this is true and this is true, so it's going to be D. Fixed costs are costs that remain the same regardless of changes in activity level, and within a relevant range is important. So within a relevant range, and I didn't put the slides in about relevant range, and relevant range means that you're within a range that doesn't require you to expand your fixed assets. So a fixed cost varies inversely with activity. So rent is a good example. So with the space you have, you pay your rent for the space and it's one rental amount regardless of how much activity you have. Now, relevant range means that you have this one set of space, and as long as what you're doing fits inside that space, you're in your relevant range. But when you get too big that you need to rent more space, then you're not within the same relevant range. So property taxes, insurance, the depreciation on building and equipment, those are all fixed. They're the same every period, regardless of how much you're producing, as long as you're staying within that same space. Once you have to expand outside the space, you're not in the same relevant range anymore. So graphically, total fixed cost, it's a straight line, because if you're in the same relevant range, it's the same fixed cost no matter how many units you're producing. And when you're looking at it per unit, it's this inverse relationship, because the more units you produce, so as the units go up, so your number of units increases, the cost per unit goes down, because the total amount stays the same, but the number of units it's allocated over goes up. And then mixed cost, you have a component of both variable and fixed. So the fixed amount is going to stay the same. The variable portion stays the same per unit. So you have this fixed amount that's here, and then the variable stays the same per unit. So it's not a proportional change overall. It's this mixed kind of relationship. So in this example, you're trying to identify which are variable, which are fixed, and which are mixed. So Bonita has a single product. We're trying to identify fixed and mixed. So here you're producing 5,000 units. Here you're producing 10,000 units. So for direct materials, the cost per unit is $1.60 when you're doing 5,000. $1.60 when you're doing 10,000. So this will be a variable cost, because the cost per unit is the same regardless of how many units you're producing. Direct labor, it's $1.90 per unit when it's 5,000. It's $1.90 per unit when it's 10,000. It's a variable cost. Utilities. All right, so it's 40 cents per unit when we're doing 5,000, $33 per unit when we're doing 10,000. So there's not a direct relationship between the two. And you see that this fixed amount, or this total cost amount, hasn't stayed the same. So this is going to be a mixed cost. There's a component of fixed in there, and there's a component of variable, because this has not stayed the same, and the per unit cost has also not stayed the same. So it's mixed. With rent, you see that the cost per unit hasn't stayed the same, but the total amount has stayed the same. So this is an example of a fixed cost. So the amount you're paying for the space has remained the same. We're in the same relevant range, so the per unit cost has decreased proportionately, as indirectly proportionately as the units has changed. Maintenance, the cost per unit has not stayed the same. The total has not stayed the same, so this would be an example of a mixed cost. And then supervisor salary, you see the per unit has not stayed the same, but the total cost has stayed the same. So this would be an example of a fixed cost. Okay, so that's an example of the, sorry, losing my words here. That's an example of the different types of costs, or the cost behaviors. The other topics that are talked about here, the contribution margin ratio. So this is restating an income statement where we have taken the cost of goods sold and the operating expenses, and we have restated them into variable and fixed costs. So the total cost of goods sold and operating expenses and other expenses were $500,000. And what they've done is they've taken them and broken them up into variable cost and fixed costs. And this will give us a contribution margin. And what the contribution margin is the amount left over after you take all the variable costs out. So each unit that's sold has left over $200 to contribute to the fixed cost. So the contribution margin is the dollar amount per unit sold that remains to cover the fixed cost of the organization. So the ratio is saying that 40% of every sale dollar remains to cover the fixed cost of the organization. So 40 cents of every sales dollar remains to cover the fixed cost of the organization. So in this is a cost volume profit analysis. What they do is they look at alternative situations. So if we make certain changes to the organization, the way they're doing sales or the number of units they're suggesting or whatever, the net income looks like this. They're changing the dollars of sales. You would go from a net income of 0 to a net income of 40,000. So that's what you would use this kind of an analysis for. Okay, that's it.